This evening, we're extremely proud and pleased to have John Calambokidis. I'm here to speak about the research or work that he has done into blue and humpback whales out in California. A little bit about Mr. Calambokidis. He's the co-founder of Cascadia Research and has served as the principal investigator of more than 50 research studies on marine mammals, marine birds, and pollution. Has co-authored over 60 scientific journals and 2 books, including the award-winning A Guide to Marine Mammals of Greater Puget Sound and Blue Whales. John is an adjunct faculty member at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, and is a renowned authority on that he's about to speak. But please give a warm welcome to him.
Nice to see all of you here, and trying to see if there's any other places for people in the back to squeeze in. There's probably a little more room along the curtain here. If you're in back and have trouble with it, you feel free to move up into that area. I'm going to be talking about primarily 2 species, humpback and blue whales, that are parts of long-term studies that we've been conducting going back to about the mid-'80s. And with both of those species, I'll be talking about both some of the work we've been doing over this long period, but also trying to touch on a few findings that are of kind of more recent discovery or interest. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the new abundance estimates. We're getting a much better picture of the population size of some of these animals and the trends for these populations. I'm going to be talking in a little more detail about a study called SPLASH, which was the largest study of a whale population conducted anywhere in the world. It was a collaborative study by 400 researchers done in the North Pacific. And so that study was completed a little over a year ago, and then the results have been coming out. We have some new results we want to present from that. There's a paper we just published on changes in distribution and movement of blue whales, and I think the Ventura paper here did a short mention of that. That got covered because that, even though that's not quite a recent finding, it involves some discoveries we made in the last 5 years with blue whale movement patterns. It just came out in a scientific journal, so it's getting a little bit of attention from that, so I want to talk about that. We also did a cruise last year to the Costa Rica Dome, an area off Central America that was featured in a National Geographic show that aired in March in a National Geographic magazine in the March issue. And I was going to talk a little bit about that. The show tended to cover some of the more cinematic, dramatic parts of the research, but didn't really talk about, I think, some of the more interesting scientific findings from that. So I wanted to talk about that. And then finally cover an issue that I think is really important around here, and that relates to some of the research that we've started to do and that other researchers are engaged in related to the ship strikes that killed 4 to 5 blue whales in 2007 in this area. And I think we have some interesting perspectives on some of that I wanted to talk about. So those are some of the new findings I'll be covering. But I did want to say that really a lot of our research is aimed at addressing some really basic questions. How many whales are there? And you'd think with animals that are as popular as whales are, a lot of people assume we know a lot more about them than in fact we do. And we do have pretty good estimates of the population size, abundance of humpback and blue whales in our region here, but they're pretty recent. And also, for many other parts of the world, there are not those kinds of estimates available. So one of the most frequent questions I get when people call is they say, well, what's the worldwide population of blue whales? And you have to say, well, I have a pretty good idea of how many there are in the eastern North Pacific, but in fact, the worldwide population is probably somewhere between 10 and 30,000. But we don't know it with a lot of precision because there are many areas where no one's been able to attempt an estimate of blue whales at all, let alone one that's recent and might be up to date. So that's still a question we try to answer. The movement patterns and what I will call, you'll see especially with the SPLASH study, I'll be talking a lot about population structure. if we're going to protect whales or understand what their population size is and how it's recovering, one thing we need to know is how are those populations structured? What are we estimating the population of? And a lot of that involves either genetic studies to look at relatedness of different groups of animals, or actually tracking the movements and migrations of animals and getting insight to what constitutes these population or management units. Well, that's a key area of our work. A third area that, thanks to technology, we've started to get an insight to is what do these whales do underwater? Often our studies in the past have either involved dead whales on flensing decks, or even with the advent of studies of live whales, what they're doing at the surface, with not really the tools or resources to look at what they're doing underwater. And now we're getting a little better perspective on how are they feeding, what are they feeding on, what sounds are they making, and I want to talk a little bit about that, especially some of the work with these tags that can now be applied on whales and give insights to what they're doing underwater. And finally, a fourth area that I think is very important, both in our research and in a lot of the research that's done with whales, is how are human activities affecting them? Clearly we know that hunting and whaling had a tremendous effect. All of the large whale populations were decimated by commercial whaling. And to very different degrees, they've shown signs of recovery or lack of recovery. And so that still remains a legacy that is still present in terms of the populations today. It's the legacy of commercial whaling. But there are a bunch of new threats that are important. Underwater sounds, especially Navy and military sonars or shipping traffic out here in the channel. Pollutants, especially with some of the animals like killer whales that feed high on the trophic chain. Ship strikes, a very relevant issue around here. And very importantly, the fact that we know the climate is changing, it is affecting oceanographic conditions, and right now it's uncertain how some of these species are going to be able to adapt or adjust to that. Now, a lot of the work I'll be talking about we do in small boats. That top right boat is actually a boat that if you drove in, it's parked on the right. I was doing a survey today. We've used these small rigid hull inflatables for a lot of our work up and down the coast going back to the mid-1980s. We like them because they're kind of cheap to operate, they're maneuverable. If we're trying to study animals in a broad area, we can trailer them up and down the coast. And for approaching animals for photo ID or putting tags on them or collecting skin samples, they're fast and maneuverable. We do also occasionally use them deployed from larger boats like this NOAA ship. And for those of you that, some of you were here at 5 o'clock, a key part of our research too in getting photo IDs has now become the Channel Islands Naturalist Corps, in that there's a group of volunteers here in the Santa Barbara Channel, coordinated by the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, and thanks to the willingness of whale watch boats that operate in the spring, summer, and fall when the humpback and blue whales are around, that allow the naturalists to come on board. They're collecting identification photographs and data that also plugs into some of the research and estimates I'll be showing, and it's become an important part of our data as well. Many of you are familiar with this. For those who aren't, one of the key revolutionary tools in the last 30 years in the study of a lot of these endangered whale populations has been the discovery that these species can be individually recognized and tracked from natural markings. And it varies what part of the body. With some species like humpbacks, it's the underside of the flukes, which can range from all white to all black, and also have a very detailed ridging, scalloping pattern on the trailing edge. You know, people want to say, and the temptation is to call this, it's like a human fingerprint. But there is so much more information on here than on a human fingerprint. I mean, I can't recognize anyone from a fingerprint, but I can recognize this. And in the North Pacific, where we now have over 5,000 different individuals, we've never had any ambiguity about, is that the same whale or a different whale? Even when a fluke is all black or all white, this detailed ridging pattern provides more than enough information. Maybe if you got in, tried to do photo ID on populations in the hundreds of thousands, you could start to approach where you could get by chance two animals that would be recognized as the same, but not much of a problem. There's some other species, blue whales, gray whales, where you can also use flukes. Though for particularly blue whales, which are the upper right, some of this is getting chopped off, I'm sorry, or gray whales, they have a highly varied pigment pattern on their sides that allows easy recognition. And in fact, this example here is a live gray whale, and then several years later, a dead gray whale that washed up. And in this case, the whale was so rotten and had been dead so long, the skin had all fallen off. I've turned this photo upside down, and I'm actually trying to put the skin back on the animal. And this is the same animal. You can see this dark area here coming in with two prongs, and that appears right here, dark area with two prongs. And you can kind of match up these markings exactly. This blue whale here is a blue whale we've actually tracked going back 30 years. And these pigment patterns on some of these animals, when you look at a photograph, in the case of blue whales that's 20, 30 years apart, they can look like they're taken just an hour apart. In the case of gray whales, they do gain different stars and markings, and they're a little trickier with large time gaps. But blue whales, we've had no trouble with these markings changing or becoming difficult to recognize. This is a killer whale here, recognized by both nicks and deformations in the trailing edge of the dorsal fin or in this white saddle patch area behind it. Now, going right to estimates, how many humpback whales are using the U.S. West Coast? And before I introduce this, I should say that, and you'll see this in some of the later figures, in our early research, we were able to see that the humpback whales that feed here in the Santa Barbara Channel are part of a feeding aggregation. We'll see an animal that is identified here in the Santa Barbara Channel. We'll see it feeding up as far north as Oregon, but generally not further north than that. They seem to occupy a range that encompasses California, Oregon, and by the time you get to northern Washington, that seems to be a different feeding aggregation with very little overlap. We've had hardly any matches. I'm trying to think if we've even had one between, say, an area north of Washington State and the Santa Barbara Channel. So we define that as a feeding aggregation. It migrates to areas south that I'll show you later. And we're able to estimate how big that aggregation is. And going back to our research in 1991, at that time there were just over 500 humpback whales that we could estimate from our photo ID research. And this is what's happened through 2007. That population now has almost tripled to just over 1,600 animals. And that's our latest estimate right now, is just over 1,600 humpback whales in this West Coast feeding aggregation. And I'll show you how that compares to the rest of the North Pacific when I talk about the splash study. This blue line shows a trend of increase at 7.5% a year. And that's what all of these, this is the actual year-to-year data. And then you see the solid line, curved line is the trend, which reveals 7.5%. And that's a pretty healthy rate of recovery. We still think that this is still below what it was historically. We don't have a lot of good tools to estimate how many humpback whales exactly were here prior to whaling. But you can look at short time periods. Whaling tended to kill lots of whales in short time periods. And you can use how many were killed as an indicator of at least a minimum population size, because usually the whaling continued until there were too few whales to make it economically feasible to find and hunt them. And there were several periods where whaling stations up and down the West Coast, and I want to say it was about a 10-year period where they killed well over 2,000 humpback whales. So that tells us the historical pre-whaling population size is probably somewhere at least over 2,000. So we're probably expecting this curve is going to increase a little bit longer, but at some point, humpback whales, like gray whales already have, may actually recover to the numbers they were at prior to whaling. With blue whales, the data is a little more confusing. This is the same time period, 1990 through the late 2000s, And these are estimates of blue whales, and you may not be able to read this in the back, but this is about 2,000 blue whales. And I have two lines plotted here. One is the estimates from the identified individuals that we have. And we use a tool called mark recapture to estimate how many animals not only do we identify, but from the resighting rates of those identified animals, how many do we project are out there that we have not yet identified. So this includes both of those. And our estimates are these triangles, and they showed a very steady set of estimates. In the early 1991-92, about 2,000. We had estimates about 1,900 in 1996. In about 2001, we had another estimate of about 2,000. And then the most recent estimate we had in 2005 was a little bit higher, up at about 2,700 animals. And some of that is due to the fact that these estimates we can't estimate precisely. There's a certain amount of noise. So there's maybe a hint that the population is either stable or slightly increasing from that photo ID data. Now this other line I've shown here in yellow that agreed really well with our estimates in the early 90s, but then plunges down to really disagree with our estimate, is based on a different technique. It's based on a count that's done by Southwest Fisheries Center on a ship survey where they do a series of zigzag lines up and down the coast, going from the coast out 300 miles, and they count how many whales they see, and they estimate a density of whales using something called line transect methods. And from that density of estimates, density of whales, they then say, well, for the whole U.S. West Coast, if that was the density, how many whales would that add up to? And in the early 90s, that agreed with our estimate. And we thought that meant two things. Number one, we patted ourselves on the back because to have two totally different methods agree with each other, well, that kind of gave you a little more certainty. We really are coming up with a good estimate. And then the other thing is, it suggested that if our photo ID was estimating the individuals present, and if that ship survey was estimating how many on average are present at one moment in time, if those two agreed, it meant most of the whales in the population were present in the survey area during the summer and fall. So we concluded two things. One, that we had a good estimate of 2,000 blue whales, and number two, all of those blue whales seemed to be predominantly feeding off California during the summer and fall when these surveys were conducted. So since then, the average estimates from those ship surveys off the U.S. West Coast have dropped to 600. So on the one hand, if you were just basing your estimates on that, you'd say blue whale populations have plummeted to a third. But because we have this photo ID, we know the population hasn't really changed. What it looks like has changed is the percent of time they are spending feeding off the U.S. West Coast has dropped dramatically. Same number of blue whales still around, but now they're using a lot of other areas, just other than just the West Coast. And we have a couple of other lines of evidence that tended to show that. We started to do surveys up in well, let me go to another slide here. Let me show you this slide first. And I think if I knew there'd be so many people at back, I would have done a bigger map. This is a map of the North Pacific showing, and I'll use my cursor here to show you what we're looking at here. This is Japan, Russia, Alaska, and California is right here. Now all of these little X's scattered around are where a blue whale was killed in commercial whaling. And the main point I want to make here is that lots and lots of blue whales were killed here off British Columbia, up here in the Gulf of Alaska, and out on the Aleutians. And here off California, where my cursor is right here, relatively few blue whales were killed. So this created a bit of a puzzle for us, because when I started doing my work in the 1980s and 1990s, all of the surveys that were being done up in these areas where blue whales were killed were finding no blue whales. And literally there were dedicated surveys going specifically to the spots where blue whales were killed, in commercial whaling, and this is mostly in the first half of the 20th century that this occurred, but it occurred all the way through 1966. There were dedicated surveys to go to the areas of concentration where they were killed, and they found 0 blue whales. So that was sort of an interesting puzzle for us. Did that mean that all of these blue whales we were now seeing off California, were they somehow missed by commercial whalers? That didn't really make sense, because there were commercial whaling operating that were, some of the latest commercial whaling for humpback whales was conducted out of San Francisco Bay. There were 2 whaling stations that operated through 1966 out of San Francisco Bay. And they took over 1,000 humpback whales. And they took just a handful of blue whales. And that's an area where we see lots of blue whales in our work in the 1980s and 1990s. So what explained the fact that where whalers took the whales was so different than where we were seeing the whales today? Well, that's where I think this pattern here that we're looking at, where now we've had this decline in how many blue whales in fact are occurring off of the California coast. The average number present also now coincides with the identification of several blue whales. Starting in the early 2000s, surveys that we were doing off British Columbia and that Southwest Fisheries Science Center did up in the Gulf of Alaska started to cite blue whales again. And when those blue whales were identified, here's a blue whale from the Gulf of Alaska. So up into that area where all of those blue whales were killed in commercial whaling. And it's exactly the same individual that had been seen in the Santa Barbara Channel in the 1990s. Here's one of the blue whales that I identified off of British Columbia in the Queen Charlotte Islands. And it's one of the blue whales from San Francisco Bay. So it was telling us that it wasn't that there were 2 separate populations of blue whales, one that was killed by humpbacks and one that was killed by whalers, and another one that wasn't, but rather they were part of the same population of blue whales. And for some reason, blue whales stopped using those northern waters during the 1980s, 1990s, and they appear to be returning to them now. And that could be a function of a couple of factors, and we've identified 2 likely candidates. First of all, the blue whale population got heavily whaled. It probably got decreased. That could have changed the availability of prey for blue whales, and why go all the way to the Gulf of Alaska if there's enough food to feed on off California? Or number 2, it could result it could be the result of a change in conditions, making prey more abundant in Alaska than it was in the last 20 years. And we actually have an indication that that is in part what is occurring. Here's a map of the Gulf of Alaska, British Columbia, California, and these dashed lines, if you can see them, connect some of the matches of those whales. So 1 in 3 of the whales identified in 2004 up in the Gulf of Alaska matched down to the Santa Barbara Channel. Just under half of the blue whales we've identified off the Queen Charlotte Islands have matched to California. Now, I don't think I'll spend a lot of time talking about it, but the main point in this paper we just published is that if we go back, there are measurements of how oceanographic conditions have changed over longer time periods. And one of the indexes that oceanographers used is called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So most of you are probably familiar with things like El Nino that occur every 3 to 5 years. Well, there are these various decadal oscillations that are longer term cycles of conditions. And when we went back and started to plot the data oceanographers had gathered of the different phases of this Pacific decadal oscillation, it not only fit pretty well. There was a change in phase that occurred in about 1999, and it seemed to shift. It seemed to coincide with the shift in when blue whales exclusively used California to feed, to now, when they're still using California, but they're ranging much farther and back into these areas they were formerly hunted. And then when we plotted all of the whaling data and where whales were killed in different time periods, when were they killed up in British Columbia, or when were they killed, say, off Mexico. And we plotted that in relation to these Pacific decadal oscillations. We actually saw it seemed to all fit together pretty well. The main period that whales were killed up in the Gulf of Alaska and off British Columbia coincided with this time period that we're in now, where blue whales seem to be returning to those areas. Okay. I'm going to jump over a few things here. I should just point out that, one thing, and this is an example of it. This is, we now have a nice recording sonar on our small boats, but this is when we were reduced to taking a photograph of our dual frequency sonar screen. And this is actually a split screen, 50 kilohertz, 200 kilohertz echo sounder. And what it's showing is that with the 200 kilohertz, that there's a dense krill layer at about 100 to 150 meters. And on the 50 kilohertz side, we actually have the track of one of these blue whales off British Columbia. And it's showing it's doing these upward lunges into this krill layer. And this is something that with these suction cup tags that I'll be telling you a little bit about, we've shown these upward lunges are where whales are accelerating and doing this lunge into a dense layer of krill at the upward part of each of these upward curves, and that right coincides. So these whales that are returning to British Columbia and Gulf of Alaska are going up there to feed. Now there's one other change that we've also noted that's occurred, and this is a bit of a confused slide here, but it shows whales feeding. To figure out what humpback whales are feeding on, we sometimes can see what they're feeding on at the surface. Other times we have indications of it by what other species are associated with them. So this is a big aggregation of sea lions, and you have gulls feeding in the same area as a group of humpback whales. And we know both the bird species that are present and the sea lions are primarily fish feeders. So we had a pretty good idea that the humpback whales were fish feeding in this area. In other areas, we encounter humpback whales concentrated with a different group of seabirds like Cassin's auklets or phalaropes that are typically more associated with krill concentration. And sometimes that isn't ironclad because you can get mixtures of fish and krill in the same area. We can also get indications from the echo sounder readings we're doing. From all of these different things, one of the changes that we've also seen with humpback whales, this is a plot of what humpback whales are feeding on in the 1990s, when they were feeding primarily on krill, which is the red bar, to the 2000s, when they were feeding primarily on fish, the blue bar. So just, you can see the dramatic change between these two plots, and this is basically reflecting that humpback whales in the 1990s, and that's when blue whales were present in largest numbers off California, were feeding primarily on krill, and blue whales are exclusively krill feeders. So it looked like lots of krill present, the humpbacks fed on krill, and the blue whales were present in their largest numbers. To the last 7-8 years, where the humpbacks have shifted to feeding on fish and only minimally on krill, and the blue whales that don't have that option, blue whales are exclusively krill feeders. That's where it looks like blue whales, instead of shifting prey, they've expanded the area they're going to. So they're going into other areas as well. And some of this matches data on some of the krill feeding seabirds in the last 7-8 years have had more trouble up off Central California getting adequate feed and reproducing at high levels. So there have been other indicators that krill abundance has been down. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about this cruise we did to the Costa Rica Dome, because I've been talking a lot about blue whales and how far north they go. But all of these whales migrate in the winter, generally to warm water, southern wintering areas. And typically for humpbacks and gray whales, where those wintering areas have been well studied, generally that's to mate and give birth to young, and they typically don't feed, they fast during that period. So the humpbacks that go to Hawaii or to Mexico, they're going to these coastal, shallow water areas. They're tropical areas with not very high productivity, and the whales are not feeding for many months at a time. Gray whales going to some of the lagoons in Baja as well as along the coast of Baja. Now, blue whales, we didn't nearly have the same information on what they do in the winter. We had a pretty good idea they migrated south, and we had data that had been gathered off areas like Mexico. But one indication was there's an area off Central America, hundreds of miles offshore, called the Costa Rica Dome. And it's not actually a physical dome. The dome actually refers to the fact that there are these strong winds that blow in winter through mountain passes, and it's a wind-driven upwelling that brings the cold, deeper water up closer to the surface and creates a dome, if you will. The thermocline is closer to the surface. And whenever you can bring colder, nutrient-rich waters up closer to the surface where they're exposed to sunlight, that's going to create productivity and the potential for plankton and then krill. So it's an area where blue whales had been documented, but we had very little information on the blue whales down there in winter. So we did a month-long expedition to the Costa Rica Dome. Any of you see the National Geographic show? So a few of you have seen this, and you know that was the focus of the show, is this expedition we did. Partly we had information from an Oregon State University researcher, Bruce Mate, who was also on the expedition, attached satellite tags to blue whales here in the Santa Barbara Channel. And then we actually could track some of those whales down to the dome, and we actually looked for and found some of those whales on the dome. We also were curious, were blue whales using this as an area to give birth to calves as well? We did identify a mother and a young calf on the dome. And this is the mother and calf. The mother turned out to be an animal we knew very well. It was an animal that 22 years ago we had first identified as a calf herself. So we knew she was 22 years old, and here she was with a fairly young calf on the dome. For those of you that saw the National Geographic show, they made a big deal about this being a newborn calf. The reality is, we could only say it was on likely weeks to at most a month or two old, but not days old. And I think they kind of played that part up because they got some really nice underwater footage of this mother and calf. The other surprising thing was that even though we found a mother and calf, we identified 68 whales down there. The mother and calf, the only mother and calf was this one animal. So it's only 1 out of 68. So in some ways, even though we did see that animals were there with young calves, the percent animals was actually very low. And if anything, it suggested that was not the primary purpose for these animals that came to the dome. It was not to give birth to calves there. Otherwise, you would have expected to see a higher proportion of calves. And that led to, I think, the other important finding that we did. And we attached some of these suction cup tags to animals, and this is actually the dive record of a blue whale on the Costa Rica Dome. And these little patches are patches of krill. And what we were able to document is that even on the Costa Rica Dome, these blue whales were diving down. I think I've got a little bit bigger one, hopefully. Yes. These blue whales were diving down to 200 to 250 meters, so 600, 700, 800 feet. And they were diving down to these krill layers and doing these series of underwater lunges on the krill. And this tag that we put on this blue whale that we're tracking the movements of, we put on in the late afternoon. And as it got into evening, both the krill layer was moving up and the whale's dives got shallower. They directly tracked the krill layer. So in 3 of the 6 tags that we put on and monitored the behavior for several hours, those animals were feeding. And now it seems like sort of an obvious answer, but prior to this, we didn't have definitive proof that blue whales were different than humpback and gray whales. And unlike those animals that fast through the winter, blue whales continue to feed through the winter. And that matches up in areas off Baja and the Sea of Cortez. In late winter and spring, blue whales are seen in those areas, and they're feeding there as well. And the picture that emerges is that blue whales, largest animal that ever lived, pretty good appetite, they're exploiting their size to be able to move long distances and continue to feed year-round. And it looks like they're doing that not only by sometimes traveling far into the Gulf of Alaska and ranging far on their feeding grounds, but also when they go down to warm water areas in winter, down near the equator. Even there, they're finding these productive areas to feed. Now, this probably isn't a density of krill that is similar to what we have in the Santa Barbara Channel. So probably the majority of their energy and reserves has to come from the feeding in the spring, summer, and fall. But they're still continuing to feed in winter. And even though it wasn't a real sexy finding highlighted in the show, I thought it was probably the most scientific, scientifically interesting finding to show that's what these blue whales were doing. Okay. I'm learning a little bit. I gave this presentation last night, and I'm skipping some slides because I ended up talking for 2 hours last night. So I'm not going to do that to you tonight. So I'm going to jump over a few things. The SPLASH study, I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. This was this collaborative study. It was aimed at some of the things we've been talking about here. What's the abundance of humpback whales? What's their population structure? What are the human impacts? But what was different about SPLASH is instead of trying to do that in just one area, we wanted to do an integrated study that covered the whole North Pacific. So not only were there already several dozen research groups that were studying humpback whales in other parts of the North Pacific, we wanted to get all of those groups working together, and we also wanted to find where we had gaps in coverage and make sure we were covering all the places humpbacks went. Because we had these intriguing little piecemeal findings about how humpback whales were moving in the North Pacific, but we had a feeling we weren't getting a clear picture of it. And so SPLASH was sort of the answer. It followed in the the model of a study done in the North Atlantic called YONA, or Year of the North Atlantic Humpback Whale, that was also an international collaborative study. But I think we not only copied YONA, but we kind of did it one better. We had 400 researchers from 50 organizations and 10 countries involved in this work. And it's arguably the largest study of any whale population ever conducted. I'm going to skip some of these. And it primarily involved collecting skin samples and photographs of animals. And skin samples for genetics, companion research, photographs to identify individuals, but also look at incidents of entanglement, scarring, or ship strikes on animals. And just to get a feeling of the scope of the area we have to cover, the North Pacific was huge. And there already were a number of known winter breeding areas for humpbacks. It included areas south of Japan, Okinawa, Ogasawara, down to the Philippines were known winter breeding areas of humpbacks. The Hawaiian island chain, off Mexico, including some offshore islands called the Rey Valleros, mainland Mexico and Baja. And then an area that we started conducting work in the 1990s on off Central America that ended up finding this was also an important winter breeding area for humpbacks in the North Pacific. So we tried to cover all of those, as well as all of the feeding areas that humpback whales go to, from the Far East and off Russia and northern Japan, the Aleutians, Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska, and these circles roughly show how we initially grouped these samples. Even though humpback whales are almost continuously distributed, we still wanted to group them into geographic areas. And of course, here we are, this is where we are right now. Santa Barbara Channel was part of this U.S. West Coast area here. And lots of people involved in it, cast of thousands kind of thing. A wide variety of types of boats used. We used, of course, our boats off West Coast. Congas were used in areas like Mexico, these small open boats. Kind of more medium ships. These are some of the platforms used, like off Hawaii. This boat was used to survey Central America and northern Mexico. And then to get at areas like out in the Gulf of Alaska and to the Bering Sea, larger ships like the NOAA ship MacArthur II conducted surveys, or that's a chartered boat we used off British Columbia. And my favorite platform off the Philippines, an outrigger canoe, was the primary platform used. So these people on this canoe, this is looks like a nice L series high-quality Canon camera and lens system, so they've got some fancy optics on an outrigger canoe. And I'm just going to show a couple of, maybe highlight a couple of findings. One is, if you take one season, we actually had 5 seasons that we did this study, but if you take one season, summer 2004, and here you have Russia, the Aleutians, Gulf of Alaska to California. Each square, white square on here, shows you where a humpback whale was identified in the splash study just during that season. And so you get a feeling that humpbacks were seen kind of throughout this area and identified over a broad set of regions. And if you actually put together and connect, and I like this figure because it's the very first figure we did. It's not in GIS, this is actually out of Microsoft Excel, where we connected all of the re-sightings of the same individual. And so all of these dashed lines show the documented movement of an identified individual, primarily between some of the wintering areas and some of the feeding areas. And you'll see, largest sample came from Hawaii. And while we knew that Hawaiian humpback whales, all of the previous research had suggested they primarily went to Southeast Alaska. Well, that finding was there, but look at how they fan out. In fact, some of the Hawaiian humpback whales went to Russia. Some went up here to the very northern Bering Sea. So it was a far more complex, varied pattern than we had expected. Similarly, off Mexico, these animals at the Rey Valleros, this turns out to be almost a third of the humpbacks that breed off Mexico, use these offshore islands. And we had no idea where those animals went. And it turns out they actually do something fairly similar to the Hawaii animals. These animals are primarily going from BC out to the Aleutian Islands. And one of them, just like off Hawaii, went all the way over to Russia as well. So not only did this huge north-south migration, but crossed and transited the entire North Pacific, in this case, going from east to west. And so any given wintering area, animals went to multiple feeding areas. And if you look at it in the reverse, if you pick one area, like say up here off Kodiak Island, the Kodiak animals, well, some of them were coming to Hawaii, some of them were going to Mexico, and a few of them were coming over here to Japan. So each wintering area represented animals coming from multiple feeding areas, and most feeding areas represented animals coming from multiple wintering areas. And so you might be tempted to say, well, maybe it's just all a free-flowing, intermixing group. But in fact, there was quite a bit of loyalty. Animals that fed, say, off Southeast Alaska and northern BC, well, each season they would return to that area. An animal generally wouldn't be seen off Southeast Alaska one year and then come over to the Aleutians in another year. So they had loyalty to specific feeding or wintering areas, but they intermixed in terms of how they migrated. So that creates a major challenge for management. The old thinking used to be there were 3 populations or stocks of humpback whales. There was the western North Pacific stock, and they bred in Japan and fed off Russia. There was the Hawaii stock, and they bred in Hawaii and fed in Alaska. And there was the Mexico stock, and they bred in Mexico and they fed off California. Well, it doesn't work out. There are elements of that present, and some animals fit that model, but many do not. Yet, for the sake of protecting humpback whales, when I show you, so on the one hand, you have this set of data that shows lots of mixing. And now let's look at, that's a little prettier way that National Geographic showed that slide when they kind of polished it up, but showing the same general pattern. Oh, before I show the genetics, I want to make one other point. And that's that when you looked at these feeding areas, and this is going from Russia to the west, Aleutians, Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska, all the way to California on the right. And each bar shows what % of those animals matched to a specific wintering area. So you don't have to worry about all the detail, other than you'll notice a pattern. There's a big dip right here. And what this basically told us is that the animals that fed in the northern Bering Sea, Aleutians, and the western Gulf of Alaska, there was a larger proportion of those animals that were not going to any of the wintering areas that we studied. And what it meant is there was a wintering area out there that has been undiscovered. And Splash, this study, helped us find out lots of things we wanted to find out. But in this case, it found out something that we thought we knew, and it showed us we didn't know. So it actually put us one step backwards. But it was an important discovery that, in fact, we haven't identified, and whalers apparently didn't successfully identify all of the wintering areas. And most likely, from how this is geographically distributed, if you thought humpback whales were going to make the most efficient migration, which we can see isn't maybe a good assumption, you'd think this missing area is probably somewhere between Japan and Hawaii. But that may not be the case. Now, how many humpback whales are there in total in the North Pacific? And we do come up with an estimate. It's this column here. And it actually, through the period of Splash, it increased steadily. At the beginning of Splash, it was about 18,000, and it increased to about 21,000. This, in one fell swoop, more than tripled the estimate of, our best estimate of humpback whales in the North Pacific. So there turned out to be a little over 3 times as many as we thought there were. And we could roughly break that down by region. And again, I'll just make a couple of main points. Hawaii seems to be where about 10,000, or about a little over half of those animals go to breed in Hawaii. Almost 6,000 to Mexico. And then Asia is actually pretty small. You'll notice in those earlier charts, there weren't as many identifications over in Asia. Well, that's not just because we had less effort. It actually was, from our estimates, there are less humpbacks that we use in the area. And if there's one troubling part, there's a lot of encouraging news about humpback populations. If there's one troubling part, it's that this Asia population, which was pretty large, there were a lot of animals killed in whaling, looks like it's the most depleted and still the farthest below what it was pre-whaling. And that may in part be because it was hit pretty hard by whaling, but also because off Japan there's a pretty high level of mortality of humpback whales occurring in fishing areas. And part of that seems to be the result of the fact that there's better reporting, because Japan went from not allowing the commercial sale of animals that were caught in nets to now allowing it, and fishermen can actually, if they catch a humpback whale, they can sell it on the market and make money from it. And so that has had the good effect of improving reporting, but it also looks like it's had the effect of maybe encouraging fishermen to put nets in places where they might catch whales, because they can make a lot of money when they catch a whale as well. And there are a lot of minke whales and other species that are also caught, but troubling is humpback whales, and that may be part of the reason this Asia population is so low. And in Splash, our West Coast estimate came out at 1,700, so it agreed really well with the other studies we were doing over a longer period. And I'm sorry I show you these big data tables. Usually I just want you to focus on one thing. The furthest right column here, there were various estimates for areas like Hawaii or Mexico, or even a historical estimate for the whole North Pacific of what populations were going back in time. And so we wanted to see, now that we have this Splash estimate, how does it compare on a region-by-region basis to what was thought to be there many, many years ago? And when we compare it, what % per year increase would be required to make those two numbers agree? And so, taking the bottom line, back at the end of whaling in 1966, there were thought to be only 1,400 humpbacks left in the entire North Pacific. And it wasn't a very good estimate, but if we compare that 1966 estimate of 1,400 to our Splash estimate of over 18,000 at the start of Splash, 39 years, it comes out at 6.8% per year increase would be required. And you remember when I showed our West Coast trend, that was 7.5%. So it's showing that for the North Pacific as a whole, it does look like overall they are increasing almost as fast as our West Coast humpbacks are. Pretty close. And that's probably a good sign that these animals are coming back from commercial whaling. Okay, Now I want to return to the splash study and the genetics. And I'm going to show you a bunch of these pie charts. And these are laid out in a map. So here's Asia over here, Japan, here's Hawaii, here's Mexico, and down there is Central America. So you can imagine it laid out. And each of these pie diagrams shows what's called the mitochondrial DNA haplotype. It's a genetic pattern in the mitochondrial DNA. And each color, each slice of this pie represents a certain haplotype. And the main thing that strikes you when you look at this is these look different from each other. Japan and Asia look different. When you look at Okinawa here, looks different in proportions than Hawaii. And Hawaii looks pretty different than Mexico. You have haplotype patterns here that are very common in Hawaii that are fairly rare. And if you look at Central America, it has a haplotype that's pretty rare in these other areas. And so what that's telling us is for genetic differences to perpetuate on this level, that means there has to be a pretty high level of loyalty. These Hawaii animals can't be just switching back and forth between Asia, with Asia on a kind of freely intermixing basis, or you couldn't end up with actual genetic differences between the animals in these areas. So it shows that even though we have all of that intermixing between wintering areas and feeding areas, animals do remain loyal to certain areas. Even though we do have some photo ID matches, we do know a few animals do occasionally move, but it doesn't look like it occurs on any large scale. And we can do the statistical analysis, and it says they're significantly different. Everything but what's connected by a white bar is statistically significantly different from everything else. And we can do the same thing with feeding areas, from Russia, Aleutians, Southeast Alaska, down to California. And again, you can see the pie charts all look different. And again, statistically, they're different from each other. Everything that's separated with a dashed line is different than everything else. Southeast Alaska, northern BC, those two were pretty similar, so that's part of one unit. But a lot of these other places were different from each other. So again, loyalty to specific feeding areas. So the main conclusions of SPLASH. New population estimate of humpbacks, 20,000, starting to get up near what it was pre-whaling, but still showing that it's increasing at a healthy rate. Asia still remains depleted. We did find, and I didn't want to go through the data on it, we did find that these populations are recovering despite the fact that a third to over a half of the humpback whales that we photographed had signs that they had been tangled in a net or in a rope at some point in their life. So they are being exposed to some of these human threats, but are still being able to recover with it. The migratory movements are pretty complex, and then the new wintering area I talked about was discovered. Okay, let's see. Let me talk a little bit about the tagging work that we did, and this is going to work into the ship strike issue. Some of the tags that we've been deploying on animals. We've been deploying a National Geographic Critter Cam, and I'm going to show you a little bit of footage from that. I think raise your hand if you've seen Critter Cam footage before, right? So some of you have. In past years, I've shown some of the Critter Cam footage, but we got some footage last summer that's pretty new, and I'm just going to show you that new footage. So we're actually able to look with video at what these whales are doing underwater. We're able to attach other tags that can monitor not only all of the movements of the whales, but also all of the sounds they're hearing and all of the vocalizations they make. And then we're also putting a third type of tag on that has a built-in GPS. So rather than have a very general position, which we get from some of these satellite tags, we can actually get a very precise position, which is something we wanted to do here in the Santa Barbara Channel. Because if we want to understand how blue whales are using the shipping lanes, especially during periods like nighttime, when it's hard to do sightings, then we have to get this kind of detailed data. Okay. And we've also deployed these tags on some other species, fin whales, humpback whales, sperm whales, what some of this is. And just I'm not going to show you any video of putting the tags on. You may have seen that in some of the shows, but basically it involves using our small boats to try to come up right next to the whale and either pressing it on in place in the case of these small tags, or in the case of the critter cam, you actually rest it on the animal's back and you have an active suction system that sucks it down. And it took us a little while to get real comfortable and find out how to approach these whales, because they generally don't like you to get up close like that. So, you know, finding ways to anticipate where they're going to surface, how to maneuver near them, and try to do this in a manner that doesn't put them at any risk or us at any risk. Why don't I show you, let's do the video right now. And let's have to escape out of here. Let's call up the video. And so let me tell you a little bit about this video I'm about to show you. It's, we gathered it off San Diego. And the reason why it was of such interest to me is because it actually showed something very different than all our previous video has shown. And first I'll just let you see just a little bit of what this looks like, and then I'll cut to a couple of key parts. So here we are, we're literally riding on the back of the whale. And the head of the whale is right here, that's its blowhole right there. We're slightly on the left side, so sometimes you'll see something stick out right here, and that's the pectoral fin, the side fin of the whale. And you'll see it use it to maneuver. And you can see that the way this whale is swimming, because it's slight, there's its head coming up, there you see the blowhole and the head, so it's kind of maneuvering around. And you can see this light area up at the top right, that's basically showing you where the sky and sun is. And it's slightly to the right because we're slightly on the left side of the whale. The whale's not swimming at an angle, it's just the camera's on at an angle. And each time you see some of these body undulations, what those reflect is actually the fluke beat of the whale. So we're actually able to count and document. If you speed this up, you end up seeing these fluke beats kind of very nicely, and we actually get those smaller suction cup pads we put on actually has a pitch and roll sensor, and we get these oscillations that we can actually look at the fluke beats. Like one of the things we discovered early on was that these blue whales, when they're diving, when they go down from the surface, they angle down and they do maybe 1 or 2 fluke beats, and then they're negatively buoyant. They just sink, accelerating as they go down without beating their fluke. And then, so here's an animal coming to the surface right here. You can see this animal surfacing, the surface is approaching. And so, you know, we got like 8 hours of this. But we want to cut to a key part, and I think okay, so now I'm going to turn to... Okay, and I'm going to keep this at real speed. Sometimes we look at this a little faster. So here's a whale, we're about 6 minutes into the dive. And the surface is up there. And what I want you to watch for is watch this animal actually look around, maneuver its head around, and then you'll see it spot something up near the surface. So there's the head maneuvering around. You can see it actually kind of looking around. And here comes the pec fin is coming out. And I want you to see right there, that's a patch of krill right there. So it spotted a patch of krill. There's the maneuvering for it. So that was pretty cool. I feel like it actually does this like 50 times throughout the video. So we actually get a bunch. So here we are. We backed up a little bit. Here it is where it's starting to look around, maneuver around. The pec fin's coming out to turn upward. And you can see the sky kind of comes down. It's turned upward. The undulations is accelerating and maneuvering to get to that patch of krill.
That looks like the Condor Express. I think if I move up, I mean, there's
there's actually one other funny sequence. Let's see if I can find it. I may speed up the thing here to see if I can find this one sequence that I want.
Where is this with?
This is off San Diego.
What are we seeing there? What is it?
So one thing to keep in mind, I want to see if I can find the whale on 3 different surfacings ends up filming us. And I'm not sure I can be quick quite. I didn't write down when the time of that first time. I don't want to go through. We have 8 hours of this, but I was going to give it a couple of tries and see if I can find where. Okay. So maybe I'm going to have to abandon that. But it's sort of funny when we realized we were on the critter cam. Now, why was this? I mean, it was nice footage, but there was actually something very significantly different about this. We were actually following this whale around after putting this tag on, and I was convinced that this animal was not feeding, because most of the studies we've done of feeding have been in areas like the Santa Barbara Channel, where there are many blue whales in a small area. That's kind of the easiest place to put tags on. There's a dense layer of krill, and animals are making these repeated dives and doing a whole series of lunges, like I showed you on some of those depth sounder readings, where they do a series of lunges into the krill layer. And so it had this very stereotypical type pattern that we were convinced was the normal way blue whales feed. Well, most blue whales that are out there in the North Pacific are not concentrated at spots like the Santa Barbara Channel. When you do surveys going hundreds of miles offshore, you run into these scattered individual blue whales in more open water. And that's what this blue whale was. And what it made me realize is that we had probably been selecting for one type of feeding behavior, but what we were seeing here is probably a very commonly used feeding behavior, but because we tagged this animal because we were trying to find an area where blue whales were in clearer water. If you try to film blue whales underwater or put a critter cam in the Santa Barbara Channel, the water is so murky and full of chlorophyll and plankton that you can't see very far. So we were doing some of these studies in areas not quite as productive, but where there were still scattered blue whales all around, and we realized this is probably a very typical feeding behavior of blue whales. And it's going to make us have to go back and sort of reinterpret the feeding strategies of these whales. Okay, let me go back and show you a few more things getting to the ship strike issue. Let me touch on the ship strike issue. And then, how are we doing on 8 o'clock? So I'll try to wrap up here within about 10 minutes. I know we've been going a while here. I did want to point out that kind of, here in yellow is the dive. This is kind of a series of observations, in this case of blue whales in Monterey Bay. This is a little bit better hydroacoustic setup, so it's showing very clearly the krill layer here. And you can see these animals going down and doing these multiple lunges. This was that more typical feeding behavior that we had documented with other critter cam deployments that was different than what we saw on that critter cam tape. And humpbacks also use that strategy when feeding on krill, except they do a whole bunch of much more rapid lunges. Their lunges are quicker, they don't involve as much up-down motion, and they get many more in per dive series. These are krill. When feeding on fish, well, we don't get blue whales feeding on fish, so nothing here. But humpbacks, when they're feeding on fish, they don't have quite that stereotype dive pattern. It's a more erratic pattern as they chase these fish balls around. So just to show you a little bit of dive data. So now to talk a little bit about, first of all, introduce the ship strike issue. And this is just sort of a collage of photographs. You know, one of the blue whales that was struck by ships with the impact area and bruising on the side. I think this is, I forget which animal this is. This might be the Ventura animal. This is, actually I have blow-ups of some of these. Let me just move on here, first of all. First of all, this is a little bit of the number of deaths that occurred in 2007 with blue whales, and this is largely data compiled by the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History that did the lead response to these strandings. And there was some confusion on some of these, you know, whether some animals that washed up, like, for example, one that washed up in northern Baja, whether it was one of these same whales or not. But it seemed fairly conclusive that there were at least 5 whales that died, and there were indications of ship strikes in 4 of them, either due to the examination of the animal or, in one case, an animal that was actually recovered in Long Beach Harbor. So it was a pretty good bet. It had come in, pushed in on the bow of a ship. And why did that occur? That was a dramatic increase in ship strikes to anything that had occurred in the past. And I'll show you a couple of plots. First of all, this is data from the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, and it actually encompasses, I mentioned, the Naturalist Corps, so it encompasses the sightings made by the Naturalist Corps on whale watch vessels. It also has some aerial survey data in it. And what it shows you basically is that the blue whales, and in many years, including the ones in yellow, which are 2007 aerial observations, the other ones are from multiple years. In most years, blue whales are concentrated here on the south part of the Santa Barbara Channel. And to some degree, that intersects with the shipping lanes that the animals travel. But you'll see especially some of the yellow sightings here that occurred in '07 were particularly in the shipping lanes. And unfortunately, this isn't really it isn't quite comparing apples to apples to compare the different years. But the main point I want you to get from this is that the area that blue whales are distributed generally is outside of the shipping lanes, but it intersects with it to some degree, and it's very close to the shipping lanes. Data that Bruce Mate gathered, he put satellite tags on blue whales right during the fall 2007 when these ship strikes were occurring. So here are the Channel Islands, San Miguel, Santa Rosa, and these are the tracks and movements of his satellite tag whales. And they show sort of a similar thing, generally concentrated south of the shipping lanes, but quite a few of the animals either crossed the shipping lanes or some of them spent a lot of time. You have several animals that spent the majority of their time in the shipping lane. And I think in the animals he tagged, about half of them he had an indication of spending time in the shipping lane. Okay. So I'm gonna skip this too. I'm sorry, I'm skipping the microphones here. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to show a blow-up of is that shipping traffic. And this is data gathered by Megan McKenna, a Scripps Institution Oceanography student working with the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. And these are the tracks in yellow and in, I guess that's red. Is that red? I'm a little colorblind. Yeah, whatever you call that color, for inbound and outbound ships. And you'll see that, at least cargo ships are, very much heavily using these shipping lanes, and tankers are kind of more broadly using other areas. But you can see this heavy degree of traffic following these shipping lanes, and these are some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. During the period, and I'm jumping around a little bit here, during this fall 2007 period, there were efforts to try to voluntarily call for ships to slow in the shipping lanes. That was repeated with notices here in 2008. And this is the average speed from the data the ships actually broadcast on this AIS system of what the average speed of cargo ships and tankers were. And you'll see the voluntary slowing of ships really didn't happen. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit of the data. So what we started to do in both fall 2007 and then in last year is we started to focus some of these deployments of suction cup tags, focus them on blue whales in the shipping lanes. To first of all, find out what are these animals doing in the shipping lanes, how much time are they spending there, and also potentially actually get how much are they coming into contact with shipping traffic. So we deployed, this is our acoustic tag that can both hear ship sounds and whale vocalizations and monitors its dive rate. This is that GPS tag that gives us really precise data on what the whale is doing. And this is one of our whales tagged in the shipping lanes, and we had ships coming by while we did it. one of our findings that came out of the tags we did, we had a hint of this from previous data, but we were able to nail this down much more conclusively. Let me see if I have a blow up of this. One of the things that came out is this is the dive record of a blue whale, and except compressed in time, because this tag was on for over a day and a half. Actually, I should say more like a day and a quarter, day and a third. It was put on in the afternoon, and you'll see the whale was diving pretty deep, but then this is what happened at night. And you'll see a dramatic difference in what blue whales do at night than what they do in the day. And this is sunrise right here. And it goes back to deep diving. So during the daytime, these animals are spending most of their time down at depth, and then just short intervals at the surface. But at the nighttime, they're spending almost all their time at the surface. And it looks like they're not feeding. They actually feed shallower and shallower as it gets night. But when it turns into night, we have no indication that these lunges, which are discernible by acceleration and then deceleration when the animal opens its mouth, these actually look like they're kind of just resting at the surface and breathing frequently. So one of the things we realized both from our past data, and then we got 2 new deployments that went through the night, is that these animals were probably much more vulnerable to ship strikes at night than at day. And that means kind of visual detection systems of encouraging ships to try to spot whales with observers may not be the most effective strategy. Though we are trying to collaborate with a company that has developed some very good night spotting equipment, and it's actually being used, or was used because it stopped operating. The Alaska Super Ferry is a high-speed ferry that, under a great deal of controversy, started to operate in Hawaii, including during the humpback whale breeding season. So they sunk a whole bunch of money into trying to develop these night detection systems to try to meet this concern that they were going to have collisions with humpback whales. So we hope to this summer actually do some tests of that system's ability, and maybe something like that could be useful for nighttime observations. The other thing that became quickly clear is that one of the tags we deployed, and we started these deployments in earnest last August, September, and we're going to repeat it this year. But some of these tags we deployed, like this ship right here, we were following a pair of blue whales. We put tags on each of the pair, and that was that photograph I showed you earlier. And just during the time period we were with the whales, we had several close encounters with ships ourselves. This ship passed less than 200 meters from the whales. And when we looked at the AIS data, it turned out that just during the 24-hour period monitored, and I think I've got this number here, 42 ships ended up passing this whale, with a fairly close encounter, because the whale from our GPS data stayed right in the vicinity of the shipping lanes throughout that entire time period. So you begin to see this is just one whale in one 24-hour period, 42 ships passed pretty close to us. The other piece of data we've gotten on ship strikes is we've been compiling the number of animals identified in 2007 during that fall period, because we were doing surveys during that September. And just during the few weeks we were here identifying blue whales, we had almost 300 different blue whales identified in the Santa Barbara Channel. And that was a record for any previous year, going back all the way to when we started in 1991, coming here to the Santa Barbara Channel. So very high number of blue whales were present in fall 2007. And also we have some indications that to a greater degree, they were using areas closer to and into the shipping lanes than most years. And I think that's the main reason we saw that spike. How often that's going to repeat, we don't really know, and that's part of what the follow-up will tell us. Right now, what we're really trying to focus on is, first of all, with all of this shipping traffic, how does that noise affect whales? Is that altering, they make calls and listen to each other. Does that alter their ability to hear each other? And John Hildebrand and Megan McKenna, both at Scripps, have been actually able to measure how much of a distance, how much closer blue whales have to be to each other to hear each other in the Santa Barbara Channel versus other areas, because of all the areas that there was data on how noisy they were, almost no area in the world could they find that was as noisy as the Santa Barbara Channel. So a lot of shipping traffic. The other part we're trying to look at with these tags is, are blue whales able to detect, hear ships as they approach, and do they change their behavior? And that could be good or bad. It could mean they change their behavior, in a way to avoid ship strikes. But it could also be that if they hear the ship, they perceive it as a threat. Many whales react to a threat by coming to the surface, which would be the very wrong thing to do. And why is that an important question? Well, some of the suggestions have been, could you create some type of maybe there's a quiet zone right off the bow of a ship that they can't be heard. Could you project sound to warn whales that a ship's coming? Well, if whales are going to react to a sound by doing the opposite of what you want them to do, then that would be the wrong strategy. And we have some indications from right whales in the North Atlantic, where they've had issues with ship strikes there, that right whales at least react that way. They tend to surface when they perceive a threat. Okay, and I think I just want to review the main conclusions, and then I'm going to take your questions. So we've touched on many different things. Humpback whale populations are increasing throughout the North Pacific, but they have a pretty complex population structure. We have indications that blue whales are shifting their distribution, even though their populations seem pretty stable. At this point, we think that's part of a cyclical change in oceanographic condition, but our major concern is, could that have something to do with climate change? It's going to take longer to determine that. We have new insights into how blue whales are using these wintering areas that they're feeding and where they're going. And we're also getting new insights into ship strikes, both that they're a major threat to whales, because those ship strikes that occurred with blue whales, those are just the ones that the whales that were struck actually washed up dead on a beach. From that tag data that I was telling you about, we know that blue whales are primarily negatively buoyant. That a blue whale usually sinks without beating its flukes and has to work to come to the surface. So unless it's got a large amount of air in its lungs or an unusually thick blubber layer, it's likely to sink. And many of the whalers knew that. Whalers in early days used to target species like right whales and bowhead whales, partly because they were whales that floated. And modern whalers, when they started to have blue whales, knew to inject compressed air into them to make sure they'd stay at the surface. So when we talk about 4 and possibly 5 whales being struck by ships in fall 2007, that's a minimum. It could be the real number is 2, 3, 4 times that, depending on how many of those whales are sinking and never being found. So an important threat that we need to monitor.